Fear of the dark is primal, buried deep in the human psyche. It's not the absence of light that unnerves us, but the vast unknown it conceals. In the dark, shadows blur into figures, the ordinary twists into the uncanny, and silence is never truly silent. Imagine standing in a pitch-black room, where the air feels heavier, pressing against your chest. Every sound, a faint creak or a whispered breath, feels amplified, closer than it should be. Your mind begins to weave images, things that might be watching from the void, lurking just beyond your reach. It's a predator's instinct to fear what we can't see, but in the stillness of the dark, it feels personal. As if something ancient, something patient, knows you're there and waits just out of sight. It's the creeping thought that when you turn away, the darkness moves, and when you stare into it, something might just stare back. This is the story of Daniel. Daniel was a quiet, imaginative child who grew up in a secluded house at the edge of a forest. His room on the second floor had a large window that framed the treetops at night. But it wasn't the forest that frightened him. It was what came after dark. It began on an otherwise uneventful night when he was 6. Daniel woke to a haunting melody drifting through his room. It wasn't a typical lullaby. It was a series of off-key hums that seemed to come from the deepest shadows, under the bed, inside the closet, or the corner where the light never quite reached. At first, Daniel thought it was his mother, but when he checked, she was asleep, and his father's snoring filled the air. The melody always started faintly, but grew louder if he didn't react. It vanished whenever he called for his parents or turned on the lights. One night, curiosity and fear mingled as Daniel followed the sound into the hallway. Shadows danced at the edges of his vision, and the melody seemed to guide him toward the basement door. But his mother's sudden appearance stopped him. She hugged him tightly, her face pale as she whispered, "Not again." As Daniel grew older, the lullaby faded into memory. His family moved to a brighter neighborhood, and he buried the strange nights under layers of normalcy, school, friends, video games. Yet sometimes, when the world was still, he'd lie awake, staring into the corners of his room, waiting, listening. "Just a dream," he'd mutter, though he never truly believed it. By adulthood, Daniel lived in the city, far from the dark forests of his childhood. His one-bedroom apartment was always lit, the hum of streetlights and distant traffic comforting him. He didn't think about the lullaby or the woman in the dark, at least not until the night the song returned. Daniel sat at his desk, surrounded by paperwork, the glow of his lamp spilling across the clutter. The faint sound of traffic outside calmed him, until it didn't. A soft, uneven melody floated through the room, freezing his pen mid-stroke. "No," he muttered, shaking his head. "It's not possible." But it was. The lullaby of his childhood, the same haunting tune that had filled his nights with dread, was back, louder this time, as if it had been waiting. Daniel searched for the source, checking his phone, speakers, and windows. Nothing explained the sound. It wasn't coming from outside. It was here, in the apartment. The hallway light flickered and died with a soft pop. The darkness seemed alive, heavier than it should be. Shadows shifted, and the smell of rot seeped into the air. Then he saw her. A hunched figure emerged from the shadows, her movement slow and deliberate. The dim light caught her gaunt face, sunken cheeks, and wiry hair. Her skeletal arms stretched unnaturally long toward the floor. "Daniel," she rasped, her voice layered with the lullaby's melody. "Do you remember?" Memories flooded back. Nights when he'd felt her presence near the closet, her song wrapping around him like a cage. He had forgotten her, but she had never forgotten him. "You left me," she whispered. Her shadow flickered closer, her cracked lips curving into a jagged smile. "But I never left you." Daniel stumbled back. "What do you want?" "You were mine," she said, her voice laced with bitterness and sorrow. I kept you safe in the dark, but you abandoned me. You don't remember, but you will. Fragments of memory surfaced, a cold hand pulling him into the shadows near the closet, a moment when fear gave way to something darker. He had belonged to her once, and she wanted him back. The next morning, Daniel woke in his bed, disoriented. The events of the night before felt like a fever dream, but the faint smell of rot lingered in the air. Desperate for answers, Daniel called his mother. Her voice trembled when he mentioned the lullaby. I was hoping you'd never bring this up again, she said. You were so young when it happened. You talked about a woman in the dark, said she sang to you. We thought it was just nightmares, until the lights started flickering and shadows moved where they shouldn't. Who was she? Daniel pressed. His mother hesitated. Her name was Agnes Merrick. She lived in the house decades before us. People said she lured children with songs and rituals. When children started disappearing, they burned her house down, but they never found her body. We thought we'd gotten rid of her when we moved. Daniel felt a chill. Why didn't you tell me? We thought it was over, his mother whispered. We thought we'd left her behind. But they hadn't. That night, the lullaby returned, louder and more insistent. Shadows stretched across the walls, and the air grew colder. Daniel sat frozen as Agnes's form emerged again, her hollow eyes glistening with something like sorrow. You've grown, she said softly, but you've never really left me. Her hand, icy and skeletal, brushed his hair. You were afraid of the dark, and I kept you safe. I sang to you when no one else would. Why now? He choked out. Why come back? Her voice wavered. Because the dark has been calling for you, my sweet boy. It's time to come home. Daniel's heart raced. I won't go with you. Agnes's smile turned cruel. You don't have a choice. The melody swelled, the shadows tightening around him like a shroud. Desperation overtook him as he fumbled for his lamp. The bulb shattered in his hand, darkness flooding the room. Agnes reached out, her fingers brushing his cheek. You'll remember soon, she whispered, her lullaby. The dark always takes back what it's owed. Daniel screamed as the shadows engulfed him, a haunting reminder that he had always been hers. The last thing he felt was Agnes's hand stroking his hair, her voice humming softly in his ear. And then there was nothing but the lullaby.